Well, happy Easter, everyone. I hope everybody is celebrating wholeheartedly this morning as we remember Jesus. We remember his death on the cross. We remember his resurrection. And we remember the fact that Jesus has called us into a covenant with him. Now, we've been in the midst of this sermon series called A Firm Foundation. If you see the construction stuff around you, it's the idea here is that as we build our lives, it needs to have a firm foundation. And that firm foundation that we've been talking about is this covenant that we have with Jesus Christ. The covenant that we have is the foundation for our life. It's the only firm foundation that our life can be built on. And we're going to be in Exodus chapter 34 today, verses 5 and 6. And today we're talking about that this covenant we have with Jesus is a firm foundation for graceful living. Having a life that's full of grace, both full of the reception of grace from God and also full of giving grace to other people. So if you'll turn to Exodus chapter 34, verse 5, before we get there, I want to tell you a story that I had found this week. There was a guy named Friedrich Langfeld. Has anybody heard of Friedrich Langfeld? He's pretty obscure. I don't think very many people have heard of him. He was a German who fought for the Germans in World War II, and so he's not exactly well known. He took part in many battles, was wounded a couple times in Eastern Europe, and then was transferred over and he was a company commander at the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. And in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, it was an awful battle. It seemed like to the United States that they could take a shortcut through this forest and that it would not be heavily defended. It turned out to be quite the opposite. And the fighting that happened in the Hurtgen Forest was close quarters and it was brutal. And what happened on November 12th in 1944 was that Friedrich Langfeld found himself repelling an attack from the Americans. The Americans eventually withdrew when they started hearing these cries for help. And these cries for help sounded very wounded, they sounded very heartfelt, and they were coming from this area of the battlefield that was a minefield. Now, the Americans had withdrawn to the point where they could no longer hear this fellow American soldier crying out, but he and all of his men could hear it. And this crying out went on, and it sounded so pitiful, so wounded, so desperate, that it tugged at his heart. And so he gave the order that under no circumstances, if medics try to go out and help this guy, are you to fire on him. And that was a very unusual order. This was not a time in a battle in a place where any quarter was being given. And yet he ordered his men, under no circumstances are you to fire at anybody coming to this man's aid. Well, for hours, the cries went on, and he realized that the Americans had withdrawn to the point where nobody could hear him. And so he got together some of his own medics, and he said, there's going to be a rescue mission to rescue this soldier. You guys are going to go out into this minefield to save this man who is our enemy. And he said, and I am going to lead you. A company commander said, I am going to lead you. And so he did. He led these men out into a minefield to save someone who was his enemy. A lot of people would look at this and they would say, what a foolish thing to do. How foolish to go out and to risk your life for somebody who's not even a close friend, not even an acquaintance, but somebody who is your enemy. And the question is, was he a fool? Was he a fool to lead these men out? Well, according to Exodus chapter 34, verse 5 and 6, this passage describes God, and it describes God in a strange time for the Israelites. They had rebelled against God. They had made the golden calf. Moses, who had gone up to get the 10 Commandments, had found that when he returned that they were worshiping an idol. And God had basically said, I'm kind of done with these people. And Moses had said, please, God, They are your people. And Moses was able to plead his case, and God accepted that. And Moses said something really interesting. He said, "You must go with us, God. If you don't go with us, then please don't lead us anywhere. Leave us here." And he said to God, "I want to see you. I want to know you. I want to see your presence." God said, "You can't do that or you will die, but I will show you kind of the glory that I have." And in Exodus 34, 5 and 6, it said, "The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." Well, what this verse does is it describes the character, the nature of God. God is proclaiming his own name. And in that time, the proclaim your name or to say your name was to say the essence of who you were. So God here is describing himself. And what we'll see here is that the description of God is right in line with the gracious character and nature. And that Friedrich Langfeld was not a fool because his actions were actually in line with the creator of the universe and with reality itself. Today we're going to look at three aspects of God's graciousness as a foundation for our own gracious living. We're going to talk about, first of all, the gracious character of God. Secondly, we're going to talk about grace and finding it in unexpected places. And finally, we're going to talk about a covenant of grace. Now, it's important for us to understand that as we talk about this aspect of who God is, we're talking about something that's vital to us because the way that we look at the world and the judgments we make about the world, they end up forming everything that we do and everything that we think. The reality is this, is that all of us look out into the world and we make a judgment. We make a judgment about how the world operates. We make a judgment about how reality works, what reality is like. And we make a judgment in that about who God is. And then we proceed, we have our actions based on what we think this reality, this world that God has made looks like. And some of us say the world is nothing but red in tooth and claw. It's nothing but dog eat dog. It's nothing but survival of the fittest. We see the world as a giant place of conflict, and we're ready for that conflict. And we say to ourselves, no one's going to take advantage of me. And then we proceed with our lives like that. But the question is that a firm foundation for your life? Is that truly the nature of God and the nature of reality? Or is there something else that we might be missing? As we look at the character that God has and the graciousness of his character, it's important for us to understand that this is God introducing himself, describing himself, showing himself to Moses, to the Israelites, to the world, who he is. And you'll notice that God is gracious. But notice, and this is really important, that God's graciousness comes in the midst of a constellation of attributes. Did you notice that? The Lord passed before him in verse 6 and proclaimed, the Lord, a God gracious doesn't come first. A God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. It's important for us to understand that all of these attributes that surround this word gracious help us to understand what it means to be gracious. They help us to put graciousness into a context. They help to bolster it and strengthen it, to make it sure as a foundation for our life. Well, let's look at some of these words. First of all, it says that he's merciful. This word is an important word because it's a word of strong emotion. It's the kind of word where someone emotionally, with strong emotion, sees the need of another. And they're moved to act by it. It's used often of a mother with her child. Imagine being a mother and seeing your child in great need, in great difficulty, and thinking, I'll get to it when I get to it. That doesn't happen, does it? See, that's the issue here, is that God is a God who is gracious. But that graciousness contains this aspect of mercy where He sees our need. Now, here's the thing. To see a need does not automatically result in strong emotion and desire to help. Sometimes you see a need, and what it does is it makes you hard, calloused, unforgiving. Sometimes when we see people's lack, what do? We look at it and we say, wow, look at that person. Have you ever seen somebody who lacked certain things and thought, well, I don't want to be around that person? Maybe somebody lacks control of their emotion. Maybe somebody lacks good grace and good nature. Maybe they're not polite. Maybe somebody is cruel. Maybe they lack love. Have you ever looked at those lacks and you think, well, I don't want to be around this person? You see, here's the thing. God looks at our lack and He's moved with strong emotion. He's moved over our vulnerability. And that's what causes God to again and again save Israel. It's not because Israel is so wonderful. It's because God is so merciful. It also says that He's slow to anger. Now, here's the thing. God also has the emotion of anger, and we need to talk about this in the midst of grace, because it's not just like God is like a somewhat senile old man who just looks at everybody and says, oh, have a great time, He looks at people fighting in an alleyway and says, well, have a nice time, and walks. That's not who God is. When God sees injustice, He's moved to a strong emotion, and that strong emotion is wrath. In fact, if you read the Old Testament, a lot of people think that when they read the Old Testament, well, God's just angry all the time. But that's not the case. God does get angry. But He gets angry because of our injustice to one another. And what kind of a God wouldn't get upset about that? Could you respect a God who looked at us as we torture and maim and kill and are just generally not very kind to one another and just thought, oh, well, no big deal? Could you trust a God like that? Could you respect a God like that? Could you worship a God like that? A God who does not get angry over injustice and evil is not a God that we can respect. But notice that God is slow to anger. What that means in Hebrew is that He's got a long nose. What does that mean to have a long nose? Well, your nose would get hot when you're angry, in their estimation. And so the idea is that He's got a long fuse. He's got a long nose. So it's getting hot, but it takes a long time before it gets to the rest of His face. I suppose that's what's at issue there. But it means that He's slow to anger. It means that He's patient with us. Now it also says that He's slow to anger, but He also is abounding in steadfast love. Now that's an interesting word there. That's used for steadfast love. It means to have a loyal love. It's kind of love and generosity and commitment all rolled into one. It's God's loving kindness, His hesed. Although I murdered the pronunciation, you can bear witness to that. But what it means is that God's love, His kindness toward us, His desire to help us, His generosity has an enduring commitment, that it is not something that is unstable. It's not something that is weak. It's something that is strong. It can be relied upon. It will always be there. And then it talks about His faithfulness, and that's a very covenantal word. It means that God will stay true to His covenant. That when God says, I am your God and you are my people, when God makes a covenant of unity with us, that He will stay true with it. Now, all of these words are important because they inform the word graciousness. Now, to be gracious means, we've probably heard this before, it's an unmerited favor. The problem, though, is that if you take that idea of unmerited favor away from all these other words, then it becomes something that can be very fragile. But God's graciousness is not fragile at all. In fact, it's found everywhere. It's found throughout creation. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1 through 3, it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple." Imagine this picture of seeing God in his throne room. In verse 2 it says, "Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.'" This is what these angelic creatures say all the time. And this is important. The whole earth is full of his glory. That has a lot of ground inside of it. But one of the things that it shows us is that when God made the world, it reflected his glory. And we don't understand just how gracious of an act that is. Graciousness is not fragile. It's so tough, it's built into the very nature of creation. You see, what it means is that when God made the world, when God created things, he allowed things, he shared his glory with things so that they might reflect his glory. Think about a God who is so generous that he says, "I have such goodness and glory within me that I will make things and I will share some of my glory with these things so that they reflect my glory." And in fact, in the medieval conception of the world, we've talked about this, how they felt like that the world moved not because of physical laws, but as a joyous response to the fact that they were made with reflecting the glory of God. All creation is overjoyed with the fact that God has shared his glory with them. It's unmerited favor, it's grace. You weren't even in existence yet, and God said, "I want to share some of my goodness with you. I want to share some of my glory with you." And so he made this whole world, and it reflects his glory and his goodness. If you've ever been outside in the wilderness and you've marveled at the glory of God and you've looked up at the stars, you've seen that these things contain a reflection of his glory that he has graciously bestowed on all of them. But the greatest thing is that he has reserved the greatest amount of that sharing of glory for mankind. And not only that, but mankind had the choice. And in that choice, we had the ability to truly appreciate, to truly worship, to truly be grateful for the fact that God had saved the greatest portion of the reflection of his glory for us. What an amazing thing. What an amazing thing. Unfortunately, what we did with that was rather than be thankful, we were afraid. We didn't understand that God's graciousness was connected to all of these other things that made it strong and sure and everlasting. And so we sought a more firm foundation. We decided that we, rather than relying on this glory as a gift from God, where we had no control over it, we would decide to become gods ourselves, where we could control our own glory. We could manifest our own glory. We could bring our own glory into existence. And in doing that, we fell. And we lost everything. And that is why Jesus came. Because not only is God's graciousness seen in creation, but God's graciousness is seen in redemption. Because having been given this great gift of the glory of God, and having decided that we did not trust that it would continue, and instead we would seek it within ourselves, we lost everything, but Jesus took upon himself all of our sin and all of the consequences of that sin to the cross. That is how firm a foundation grace has. That even in the midst of our rebellion against him, he will not let us alone. That his connection to us goes all the way to the grave. That when he said, "I am with you, I am your God, and you are my people," when he said that, he meant all the way to the grave. Why? Why? Because it's not just grace. It's merciful. It's slow to anger. It's steadfast. And it's faithful. Christ on the cross became sin for us. He took our sinfulness and all the death that came with it. And we see in Him a complete manifestation of God's mercy, of His grace, of His patience, of His steadfast love, and of His faithfulness. What's important to understand is that when we see the cross, we don't see an act, we see a character. This is the character and nature of God. Just as God, in introducing Himself to Moses in Exodus 34 and saying, "This is who I am," God shows and reveals His character in the person of Jesus Christ. Have you ever been surprised by somebody? People will surprise you sometimes, won't you? Sometimes it's a bad surprise. Those aren't very fun. You know, I never expect you to do that, and here we are. Yay. Nobody likes those. But sometimes people will surprise you in a good way. Sometimes people will, and maybe they even surprise themselves. Have you ever done that? Have you ever done something generous and you surprised yourself? I mean, you said, if I'm being honest, normally I'm kind of a jerk. But here in this moment, for some reason, I was gracious. That's not what we see on the cross. On the cross, we see the revelation of the character of God. Think about that for a moment. The God of the universe is revealing to you His character, His love for you, His grace toward you, His faithfulness to you. God reveals all of that. The true joy that's available to us in knowing the riches we have been given in Christ Jesus knows no bounds. Because if you really understand what Christ has done for you on the cross, if you really understand the power of the love that He has shown us, the depth of the grace that He exhibited on the cross, the fact that there is no separation, nothing on this world, nothing in this world can separate you from the love of God. There is not one thing, there is no obstacle that is too great. There is nothing that you have done that is too bad. That you can be united to God and nothing can stop that. If you really understand that, then nothing in this world can touch you. There is no poverty that you will fear. There is no rejection that you cannot overcome. There is no loss that is too significant in comparison to the riches found in Christ Jesus. But not only that, but God shows us abundant grace, not just in saving us from our sins, but in His desire to sanctify us. We talked about how God's grace was seen in our creation, that He wanted to share some of His glory. Well, we messed that up in our sin. But here's the thing. Not only does God save us from that sin, but now the game is afoot. The plan is back in action. He doesn't just leave us as our unglorious selves and say, well, hey, I saved you. Because salvation means restoring us to the glory that He wanted to impart to us in creation. And that is what sanctification is about. If you get baptized into Christ and you say, hey, I'm not going to hell, that's it, see ya. You're missing the glory of God. He wants to transform you into glory. He wants to give you every good and perfect gift. He wants to give you the greatest gift that could possibly ever be imagined to make you like Him. Try to define a better gift than that. Try. Think about it as long as you want. I'll wait. You can't. There is no amount of money. There is nothing that compares to God wanting to share His glory with you. Well, the second thing we have to understand here is that we find grace in unexpected places. Because of God's nature being gracious, and because He has created the world to reflect His glory, what that means is we'll find elements of grace in unexpected places. And one of these unexpected places is the law. In Psalm 119:97, it says, "Oh, how I love your law, it is my meditation all the day." Can you imagine that? Guy sounds weird, doesn't he? Oh, how I love your law, it is the meditation all day. Now, maybe if you're a lawyer, you can understand glorying in the law. But I think for most of us, the law is something to be feared, something to be dreaded, something to hope we don't run afoul of, something that we hope to think about as little as possible. And yet here is the psalmist saying, I love your law. I want to meditate on it all the time. Why? Why would he say that? Because the law, which was so unpleasant to me as a child, rules. See what I did there? The law rules. Fine. I see how it's going to be. The law rules. And I don't mean from the standpoint of the law rule. I mean the law rules because here's the thing. It's the revelation of God. It's who He is. You see, the psalmist wasn't saying this out of some rigid slavery to the law, but a loving and joyful response to a manifestation of the character of God, to a revelation of who He is. That's what the law does. The law reveals to us who God is. It reveals to us His goodness. It reveals to us His glory. That is just one of the many places that you'll find grace unexpectedly. One of the biggest, I think, for our time is we can find grace in inequality. Now, as soon as I say that, I recognize that I'm on thin ice. But I'm not talking about the kind of inequality that's false and arbitrary. I'm not talking about man's inequality, the inequality men impose on other men. That's not the kind of inequality and injustice that I'm talking about. I'm talking about God's grace that's seen in inequality. I'm talking about the fact that all of us are different. I'm talking about a real and true diversity. You see, God has made the world with true and real diversity. We are different. We are not equal. We are different. Now, we're equal in God's desire to love us, desire to see us brought to repentance. We're equal, or we should be equal, under the law. There's a lot of things that we should have equality in. But the foundation is important to understand that at our most basic selves, while we are equal, we're all equally human beings, we are very unequal in our gifts and in our talents. And there is a perverse kind of jealousy that can take over us. We can start to deny true diversity and the glory of God that's seen in it. And in fact, that's what you see in the garden, where Adam and Eve did not see the inequality between them and God and glory in it, but they saw the inequality between them and God and were jealous over it. The reality is this, that God's grace pops up in unexpected places, and inequality is one of them. You know what? I was moved by the band's worship set. I cannot do that. There was a spot open right there. It was open, and I was standing right there. And I actually took keyboard lessons when I was a kid. And I could see the keyboard. And I looked at my hands. And I said, nope. You're welcome. Why? Because I do not have this kind of gift. I do not have this kind of skill. This is not who I am. But it was given to me by the musicians by grace. It was shared. They shared. They worked incredibly hard this morning, putting together that worship set to share it with us. That is an element of God's grace. And you know what? It doesn't matter whether you can sing. It doesn't matter whether you can play this instrument. You don't need to. Because God's grace is found in the inequality here. Because God's grace is an opportunity to serve one another. It happens in my body all the time, and it's what keeps me alive. My lungs and my heart are different. There's diversity inside of me. And if they weren't different, they couldn't serve each other and they couldn't serve the body. If I had two hearts instead of a heart and lungs, I would be dead. The reality is that God has made every one of us different so that His grace may abound through us, so that He might be glorified as we use our gifts to help one another, to serve one another, and to glorify God. You see, this whole idea of grace is at the very foundation of everything God has made. And we can spend a whole bunch of time glorifying God and celebrating this grace, or we can spend a lot of time upset that we don't have what He has or they have. We can spend our time in jealousy. We can spend our time in misery. Or we could say, God, thank you so much that you have made us all different, because now each one of us has something unique to contribute. And in that, we all get to celebrate God's grace, and we get to reflect the nature of God. Well, grace is also a foundation of joy. In fact, it's the only true foundation of joy. Joy is not found in the denial of grace. You see, when we were in the garden, we were afraid that the gift of God might end at some point, and so we sought to establish those gifts within ourselves as our own little gods. And we lost joy in the process. God's love, God's grace is loyal, and it's faithful, it's sure, it's strong, it's everlasting. And we know that the only real reason that we ever experience joy is when we get unmerited goodness, when we receive unmerited goodness. In our fear, we want to establish it all as our wages so that we can demand it. But when we get our wages, are we experiencing joy? No, we say, that's what I get. Give me what I'm owed. And then when you get it, you don't go, yay. You say, this is what I'm owed. But when you experience grace, what happens is that you get overjoyed. This is actually why casinos exist. It is. Think about it. It's why casinos exist. We all have jobs we can go to where we can get our wages, but there's something joyful and something exciting in receiving something that's unexpected and unmerited. You don't need a casino. You've got God. And you're experiencing that all the time. Well, finally, let's talk about a covenant of grace. We could go on with the unexpected places that we find grace, but we need to understand a covenant of grace. God did not extend His covenant to us in Jesus Christ. Jesus did not come and die on the cross for us because we were worthy. And if you want to have joy in your life, you've got to get to the point where you realize how unworthy you were so that you can understand how great the gift was. You see, this is a frightening thing for us to experience. It's very frightening for us because we want to be worthy of it so we can demand it. But the reality is that we're not worthy of it. We don't get to demand it. It's offered to us as a free gift, and a gift that's so great, so glorious, so overwhelming, so endless, that how can we do anything other than experience joy at its reception? This whole week, in our conversations with God and our conversations with God that are found on our website, on our YouTube page, on our Facebook page, those are all tools for you to use to work this out into your life throughout the week. I want to encourage you to make use of that this week. But the whole point of those is so that you can experience the joy of this covenant of grace. You did not deserve it. It's not about your goodness, your glory, your worth. It's about God's goodness, God's glory, and God's worth. God gave us this covenant of grace because He is a gracious God. That is who He is. That is what He is. And in celebration of receiving that grace, there is no end to the joy you can experience. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God." You see, Jesus died on the cross, but then He rose again. And if you're in a covenant relationship with Him, you guys were united in death. That death was yours. You got to give it to Jesus. And He rose from the dead, and guess what? He's giving you that life. What a great trade. You give Jesus your death, He gives you that life that is seated at the right hand of God. There is nothing better than that. Imagine the joy. What was that? I know it hasn't happened for a while. I'm kind of out of the loop on these things, but there was a big lottery not that long ago. By not that long ago, I mean within the last 10 years. My perception of time is not the best in the world. So how much was it? It was like over $1 billion, right? Was it 2 billion? Does anybody know? Was there any winners of that in here? Let's get that out of the way first. No, nobody won it. Can anybody help me? Die in here. Help me out. 1.5, 1.2? That's good enough. Thank you. So here's the thing. Imagine winning $1.5 billion. Would you experience any joy over that? Maybe some fear and trepidation? This microphone, I would replace this. So here's the thing. Can you imagine how joyous you'd be? Can you imagine this family celebration? Here's the thing. There is nothing that $1 billion+ can buy you that's not going to corrode. That's not going to die with this world. There's none of that you can take with you when you're dead. And so if you win the lottery and you win $1.5 billion, by all means, celebrate. Invite me to the celebration. I'll celebrate with you. But understand that celebration has some pretty big boundaries to it. But all of us have been the recipients of God's grace. And it is worth far more than $1.5 billion because it never ends. There is no end. Imagine this. Here's the thing I was thinking about this week, and it shows how deep of a thinker I am. I was thinking about the fact that if I had won $1.5 billion and somebody asked me for money, how that would be different than the way that it's experienced now. You know, here's the thing, and I'm not talking about just, going down the freeway and there's a guy there and he says, "Hey, can you give me a few bucks?" I'm not talking about that. Because obviously most of us make enough money that's not a big sacrifice for us. But if you won $1.5 billion and somebody came up to you and they said, "Can I borrow $10,000?" Like that, the experience of that would be so much different than the way that most of us experience that now. You know what I'm saying? Like $10,000 for most of us, it's like, whoa, let me think if I can pay. Some of us, that's just completely, like I can't, there's no way I could do that. But if you want $1.5 billion, you might have that in your wallet. That money might have slipped into between the couch cushions. You know what I'm saying? Like it changes everything. Here's the thing. Can we have grace for one another? If we're in a covenant of grace with Jesus and we've received the riches of eternity, can we live graciously with each other? How will it change our lives to live this out? If this is the nature of the world and if we've received everything, what kind of a sacrifice is really all that big? Frederick Langfeld led his troops out to that injured American soldier. He stepped on a mine and died later that night. You can now go to the place where it happened and you can see a monument that was erected in his honor. The only monument in World War II, or from World War II, that was erected from enemy combatants to their enemy. Because the monument was erected by United States soldiers who served in that area. Was he a fool? You could say that he was, because maybe he would have survived the war. Maybe he would have gone it. But here's my question. Was his life better because he was that kind of person? Take away that moment, that act, because most of us will never be called to that kind of a sacrifice. But because he was the kind of person that was willing to do that, do you think that his life was better for all the years that he lived up until that moment of his death? Do you think that he had more friends? Do you think that people could rely on him? Do you think that people remembered him when they forgot so many others? The reality is that God is gracious, and he has called us through the death and resurrection of Jesus into a covenant of grace.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian Church, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to his church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week, everyone.